Hello, and welcome back again to Murder, She Told. If you are new here, please like, subscribe, and comment and interact with this video. If you subscribe, please hit that bell notification so you are informed when I upload. For those who are returning, thank you for coming back. I'm really excited about this true crime story that we're going to be talking about, and it honestly is a story that everybody should know. And if you don't know, don't feel embarrassed, but there's a reason why you don't know, and we'll get further into that as we go into this story. But we are going to be talking about the murder of Emmett Till today. This story has been passed down for years through Black oral history, almost exclusively. When I was looking back at my time in school as a kid and growing up and learning about American history, this wasn't mentioned at all when I think about it. And not that, particularly we would learn about this in like second grade, but even in high school, there may have been a slight mention about it. But I was in AP American history, and so we are kind of focusing more on what is more likely to be on the AP test itself. So it was more based on how quickly we can get through the book and less based on really discussing the themes and concepts of American history and unpacking those. So I don't recall spending any time in my high school career talking about Emmett Till. It wasn't until college that I was able to interact with the story at all. And that's really embarrassing. As a Black woman, a lot of our histories, a lot of our stories, you get used to it pretty young, are not told to us through our teachers, through educational institutions at all. They're usually taught to us by our family, by older generations, and we carry that with us and tell our kids, and that's how we have learned about so many different instances of racism or Black history in this country, because Black people have just carried it through our bloodline for generation to generation to make sure that it won't die out. The civil rights movement was a lot more complex and well orchestrated than many people have a working knowledge of. And I'm just going to keep it a buck. A lot of people think that it was only Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks who contributed to the peaceful protesting of the Montgomery boycotts and other things like the dining counters in restaurants and, just to end segregation in the South. But the reality is, and I learned this only through making a point to take several African American history classes in college, that in fact it was extremely organized and extremely orchestrated. We are taught as children that it was a spontaneous thing, that Rosa Parks just decided she wasn't going to move from her seat and she was going to just stay in her seat and not let the white bus driver get her down or whatever and make her move. And Martin Luther King quickly followed suit with the momentum that, of support in the Black community that she was getting. That's not it. There were several different organizations. There was SCLC, there was SNCC, there's a lot of other, church organizations, local organizations, all of these things that were working in tandem together in order to push for equality in the South, in order to push for the ability to vote for Black people in general, nationally, as well as the ability to, and discrimination in the South with the Jim Crow laws. So there were many different organizations that had a focus on many different aspects of racism during that time. So I think that's one thing that we need to understand. Now, how does this relate to the story of Emmett Till, you may ask? Well, what a lot of people don't know, because it's not really talked about very openly, I think in recent history, much like the Tulsa massacre, it's starting to be talked about more and more in mainstream media. But the Emmett Till murder was a huge catalyst and inspiration for Rosa Parks to say no that day on the bus. She is quoted that she felt the spirit of Emmett Till and decided that she was going to defy the law and not give up her seat as a memory to him and as a memory to his life. We'll get into why Emmett Till's murder was so heavily publicized all throughout America, and why, Rosa Parks may have felt inspired by his untimely death. But ultimately, I think it's really important to note that the Montgomery bus boycott happened 100 days after Emmett Till, I believe, was laid to rest. So they are very tightly wound. Rosa Parks has been cited to say that it was a huge inspiration for her. So we are going to get into some things on this Black History Month for sure. Other things to note. Lynching has never been and will never be something that is abnormal in the United States, especially lynching based on race. Now, I just want to add some historical context here because we kind of talked about it. We will talk about it, or we have talked about it, depending on how I structure how this video comes out, in my 13th documentary reaction. But ultimately, lynching was not abnormal in the South, and a lot of times it was for things as petty as a Black person was more successful than a white person, or there was jealousy. There was a story that I came across on TikTok about how a white woman had basically lied and said that a Black boy had touched her, and he was lynched in the 30s in the South, and she only did that and made that lie up because she was jealous of the beauty of his sister. So, not great. But like I was saying before, it was not abnormal for lynchings to happen. In fact, in Mississippi alone, where Emmett was ultimately lynched, over 500 Black men, women, and children had already been lynched in Mississippi, and over 3,000 Black individuals had been lynched over across the South in that time frame. So again, not abnormal. There was a lot of precedents for this, and we'll talk about that more as we get more into the details of the story. But ultimately, the reason why Emmett's case was so enthralling was because of his youth. He was only 14. The fact that he was not from the South, he was visiting his family in the South for summer vacation and ended up getting lynched. The strength of his mother, Mamie Till, who, despite everyone warning her not to, trying to pull her not to, showed her strength by allowing an open casket and essentially putting her son's lynched dead body on display for the entire area to see. And he was on display for 5 days. There were pictures of his face and his body and the, injuries he suffered that were published not just nationally, but internationally as well. This was a news story of a little Black boy that made it to international news all over the world. And I think this is when the starting and the mounting of pressure from within, out and outside from other countries about the race problem in America began to really take center stage. So I think those are some important things to note beforehand. We will talk more in detail about each of those things. But I just want to kind of insert myself before I start telling the story and talk about my personal experience with the story of Emmett Till. Now, as I've said before, I have a BA in sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And like I also said before, I had never heard of the story of Emmett Till my entire life until college. I know. Now, everyone has their issues. Everyone has, blind spots of knowledge, definitely. But I just want to point out and say this. I have older people in my life. My dad's father was born in Louisiana and grew up in Texas around this time, the 40s and the 50s. So he knew this story. Of course he knew this story. My grandma as well, who grew up in Staten Island, knew of this story. Absolutely. But I think the most important thing about it is the generational trauma that it represents. I think it's important when we're specifically talking about Black history to Black people to not be judgmental about where their starting point is because of generational trauma. My grandpa and grandma never talked to me about Emmett Till because it was an extremely traumatic story for them at that time. And I believe that it wasn't until we were older that they were, more open to opening up about some of the things that they saw racially in their lifetime. A lot of older Black people would rather not remember or talk to the younger generation about what they saw. Now, that's not right or wrong. I think it's a very strong boundary to make, and I think it's done in order to protect their mental health and their sanity, to be honest. But I think it's important to note that this is super common. I learned about the Emmett Till story in college in my very first sociology class, Sociology 101. Shouts out to Fran, RIP to her. She was a kooky, fun teacher, and she was wonderful to be, my first introduction to sociology because she made that class so fun. But she was the one who introduced me to the Emmett Till story. Now, we watched the History Channel documentary on it in class one day, and I remember she was warning us the class before, and she was like, it's very graphic, it's, kind of just saying it's, you're going to be tested on this, so you need to watch it, but just so you know, it's not a happy-go-lucky movie. And I went in, I was so curious about it because I'd never heard his name before, but I was like, okay, let's go into it, blah, blah, blah. It was a classic History Channel documentary on it. I believe you can find the exact same one on YouTube, and I will link it down below if you want to see the documentary for yourself. Really good, really sad, but it really fleshes out a lot of details, and there's interviews with Emmett Till's family, so you get more of the first-hand account of when they found out he died and he was murdered and all the situations that led up exactly to what ended up happening to him. But I remember watching that documentary and feeling physically ill. And it struck me because, mind you, this was 2014, towards the end of 2014, and this was the year that Trayvon Martin, earlier that year, Trayvon Martin had been murdered by Zimmerman and stuff like that. So a lot of the racial tension, the Black Lives Matter stuff, and, just kind of understanding our true placement in society started to really hit me after the verdict of the Trayvon Martin case came out and he was able to walk. Ultimately, I was in a very sensitive, racialized headspace at that time. So the movie made me physically ill. It was an emotional experience for me, especially for the first time watching it like that. And I remember coming out of the classroom in just a complete daze and just kind of like not speaking, just walking straight back to my dorm room and just sitting and laying in my bed and just thinking about Emmett Till and his very short-lived life and what he had to endure. And it made me so emotional. I cried several times over it, of course, but I just honestly felt that his story is a story that is one of strength and is one of innocence. It is one of pure evil, in my opinion, and I think it is one of the most perfect stories to be told through a true crime lens in a true crime context. So please stick around for more. We are going to start getting into the story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was born July 25th, 1941 in Chicago, Illinois. In Chicago, Illinois, to his mother Mamie Till, as well as his father Louis Till. Now, it is really widely speculated about Mamie and Louis's relationship. It is known that they had split up when Emmett was still really young, but there are some accounts that he was abusive. There are other accounts that, it just didn't work out. And there are some accounts where he kind of was still a little bit in Emmett's life. Suffice it to say, it's not really confirmed the exact relationship Louis had with Emmett and his mom. But there are several sources that do say he was abusive, and that was a cause of their split when Emmett was still young. Louis Till died in 1945, and he essentially was executed for sexually assaulting 2 women while he was in, I believe, Italy, in the armed forces. He was an army man during World War II. So obviously, Emmett didn't have a lot of really clear or memories of his father in his life, and it was mostly his mother and himself for most of his life. Now, Mamie Till was originally from the Mississippi Delta area, specifically Webb, Mississippi. Now, when she was 2, her and her family moved up to Chicago, Illinois, through the Great Migration, which is something I'm sure a lot of people know about, and I'm going to quickly refresh your memory if you don't know about it. Migration specifically talks about the relocation of over 6 million African Americans from the South to the West, to the East, and to the Midwest between the years of 1916 throughout the 1970s. So over 6 million African Americans left the South to, go to different parts of the country, because obviously, due to slavery, most of the black population was concentrated in the South. Now, I'm going to put a pin in this and kind of go on a little bit of a tangent about the Great Migration really quick. What a lot of people don't know, because what I was taught as a kid, and comment down below if you were also taught this about the Great Migration, but what we were taught as kids is that it was centering around economic growth. Now, the North was industrializing, the South was still struggling to pick up their crop-based economy post-slavery. So there weren't a lot of opportunities other than being a sharecropper or maybe a preacher in the South, maybe a teacher, maybe. But there weren't a lot of opportunities for upward mobility. So oftentimes the Great Migration is framed as a time period where black people decided to make the move to other parts of the country to seek out jobs, working on ships, working in factories, all sorts of jobs like that, instead of trying to make it work in the South. What a lot of us black people know about the time period between slavery ending and 1916 is that it was an incredibly violent time. There was a complete resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan during that time. The South was not losing the Civil War very well. So a lot of these people who were relocating through the Great Migration were mostly relocating to escape the very intense violence that was going on in the South at the time. They were effectively war refugees. And they weren't just going to work in a factory to have a better life. They were going to escape almost certain death in a lot of cases. So I think it's important to say that about the Great Migration. It wasn't just, I want to work in a factory, I want to stop being a farmer, as we were taught. It was a lot darker than that, and these people were fleeing for their lives, absolutely. So Mamie's family was one of the 6 million people, African Americans, that moved from the South to the North, and they settled in Illinois. As I stated before, Mamie had essentially raised Emmett on her own with the help of Emmett's grandmother and her mother in Chicago. But in the late 1940s, Emmett and his mother ended up moving to Detroit for a short while, where Emmett's mother remarried to a man nicknamed as Pink. The marriage did not last very long, but Emmett kind of grew homesick for Chicago, so he moved back in with his grandmother, and his mom and stepdad soon followed him, but the marriage didn't last once they moved back to Chicago, and I believe it was 1952 that marriage ended, and they stayed in Chicago while Pink moved back to Detroit to live out his single life. At the age of 6, Emmett contracted polio, which was a huge deal at the time. Now we basically have effectively eradicated polio, but it was a big illness, and he was very sick for a very long amount of time, and he developed a stutter. But through being able to nurse him back to health and all sorts of things, Emmett was essentially the miracle child that survived polio, and he was the apple of his mother and grandmother's eye. So as Mamie was a single mother, she was a working woman, which was common for a lot of black women at the time. Very rarely were we housewives, so let's talk about that. But she essentially worked as a clerk for the Air Force. She was able to bring home a pretty decent salary for a woman, and Emmett, being the amazingly sweet and boisterous kid that he was often described as being, decided to take it upon himself to do the cooking and the cleaning and the housework while his mom was at work, because it would be a big burden to do both. So he decided to pitch in. He would cook, he would clean, and make sure the house was tidy for her when she got home. And he was, a proactive, loving, kind, young 14-year-old kid who cared so deeply about his mother that instead of trying to play or, take advantage of the fact that his mom wasn't in the house very often because she was always working, he did the housework and made sure she came home to a hot meal and a clean house. So I love that tidbit about Emmett. I think it says so much about his character. I think it says so much about who he was raised to be by his mother and grandmother and his family. So it makes what happens to him all the more depressing, because he seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, just him being a kind young man. In 1955, Mamie Till's uncle Mose Wright came up from the south, from the Mississippi Delta where he lived, for a family funeral, and throughout the time he was there, he was telling Emmett all of these stories about what it was like to grow up in the Mississippi Delta, all the things he saw, all the things he experienced, and Emmett was starting to get really excited. He really wanted to spend some time and go down to the Mississippi Delta and see where the other part of his family was and get to know them, as well as see where his family was birthed and raised for the most part, until his mom and his mom's immediate family moved up to the north in Chicago. He was also further convinced because two of his older cousins, Wheeler Parker and Curtis Jones, I believe it was Curtis Jones, were also planned to be taken back to Mississippi by Mose Wright, and it had already been orchestrated. So Emmett was putting a lot of pressure on his mom to allow him to go to experience Mississippi with his cousins, with his uncle, to get to know the land and to get to know the roots of his people. He was really, really inspired by the stories that his uncle was telling him about the area. But Mamie was super, super, super hesitant about wanting to let him go. Obviously, she knew more than he did about what it actually was like in the South for Black people. Though she left when she was young, she would often go down and spend time with her family down there. So she had a history of the differences between the North and the South for Black people at the time, and why her parents and family decided to flee to move up north. So she was super, super hesitant to let Emmett go. She wanted to take him on a trip to Montana instead. That was already on the books, a plan that she would rather have done with him. She was trying to bribe him to go take the trip with her to Montana instead of going down to Mississippi, by trying to convince him that she would teach him how to drive a car and he would be able to drive there and they'd have a really good time. And there was no budging Emmett. He was just like, I want to go. I'm going to go, and I want to go with my cousins. So after a few days of begging and back and forth between him and his mother, he was ultimately allowed, given the go-ahead, to be taken back down to Mississippi with his great uncle Mose Wright and his cousins. Where they were going, where Emmett's uncle Mose Wright resided, was a place called Money, Mississippi. Money meaning dollar bills, y'all. Mississippi. Though the name was deceiving, it was an extremely small and extremely rural town that was mostly inhabited by people who owned farmland and those who worked the farmland, and a very small amount of stores. There was about 3 stores, 1 post office, 1 cotton gin, and a couple hundred people that resided in Money, Mississippi. So Mamie's hesitance didn't come out of nowhere, because he was going to go from Chicago, a big city, especially at the time, down to an extremely rural part of the country in Money, Mississippi, where she knew what type of time it was between black and white relationships at that point in time. So she was rightfully really nervous. She did not approve of Emmett going, but she felt like, what's the worst that could happen? He's going to be with his family. He's 14 now, and he wants to meet and spend time with his cousins. So who am I to stop him and see, where I lived and where I was raised and born? So she very reluctantly let him go, but it was really under the guise that Mose Wright was a respected person in the town. He was a preacher as well as a sharecropper, and she didn't want to step in between Emmett and getting some time in Mississippi and some time with his family. So she let her fears kind of go by the wayside, even though they were really real fears, and allowed him to go to Money, Mississippi with his uncle. But before Emmett was allowed to go, Mamie had a very serious talk with him. Now, this is a talk that I think a lot of black kids get a lot of the time, when you're told that you are different and you will be treated differently because of this. But what a lot of people don't understand, and though the North was still extremely segregated and racist, there was different levels. There's levels to this shit. And the South was a whole nother ballgame. The customs, the way that black people could exist in the North were honestly like fantasies for a lot of black people who were stuck or were unable to move to the North from the South. My grandpa would tell me that it was super common that if you were on the sidewalk and a white man was on the sidewalk, you as a black person had to step off the sidewalk so he could walk past. Just little petty manner things, I'm putting manners in quotations, about how to properly deal with white people in the rural South, because there were different rules. There were a lot of rules, and if you didn't do one of those rules, there was likely violence attached to that. So calling them sir and ma'am, stepping off the sidewalk, all of these things were important knowledge to impart on someone like Emmett, who had never really been to the South, who doesn't know the customs of the South, especially for a young black boy, which is honestly a huge fear in the South. Black men are always characterized as the biggest savages and the most fearful, and he was approaching an age where he was getting bigger and older, so she had to sit him down and have a real conversation about the different customs in the South. Now, like I said before, the North was not racist. It very obviously was racist, but they did their racism differently. instead of having Jim Crow laws, they would redline black people to only living in particular areas that were dirty and congested and just less likable than white neighborhoods. And they did this to keep all the people of color, all the black people in one area and all the white people in a different area. So you didn't really technically need Jim Crow laws because all of their doctors, all of the shops they went to, their houses, the people they socialized with, their churches were all in one area. And the whites had the same in another separate area. So there wasn't a need to say, oh, this school is for coloreds only, while the other only school in the colored area was for colored people. Do you know what I mean? So it was a more covert way of doing it than the very overt South way of doing it, which is like, okay, you're black, you can't drink from here, you can't go in through this entrance, you can be only on the back of the bus. All of these ways that Southern society kind of degraded people really openly. Of course, people take that now historically and like to say that the North was better than the South and the Southern whites were, more egregious than the Northern whites and things like that. The reality is they're both one and the same. No one was better or more evolved than anyone else. It's just that the systems for which oppressing black people were maintained and controlled were completely different, and it allowed for plausible deniability for the whites of the North to kind of act like they were better than the whites of the South because they didn't have Jim Crow laws, when in fact they did live in a highly, highly segregated, and we still do, world and cities and all of that. They did exist. If you know anything about the Chicago riots that had to do with black people going into a white area, I believe it was in Cicero, honey, then you know that the Northern whites were just as violent and mean and ugly and evil and vile as the Southern whites. But, we'll talk about that at another time. But I think it's really important, and I think it was really important, a really important conversation for Mamie to have with Emmett in terms of describing how a black boy was to be acting in the South versus the North. She said, if you have to bow, if you have to take your hat off, please never forget the certain ma'am. These are important things because this could have very violent repercussions if you do not choose to go through with them. So, he kind of shooed it away. He obviously was listening, but he didn't really understand. He didn't grow up in the South. He didn't have a working memory of that. And I think that's important to note. Because like I said at the top of this, my grandma grew up in Staten Island and she had family in the South that she would visit. And she remembers when she was a kid, her and her sisters sat at the lunch counter and they kept getting ignored. And then finally someone was like, you can't sit here. And that's when they finally realized the difference, because in New York or Staten Island where she lived, that wasn't necessarily something that people would worry about, because ultimately the races were separated anyways in terms of where they lived and where they socialized. So it didn't really matter to get petty about counters and this and that, when in reality, in the South, that was a very normal way that people existed. The races existed. The blacks could not be at the counter and they would not be served. And so that was kind of a rude awakening for my grandma and her sisters when that happened. But I can understand through that story how Emmett wouldn't really know exactly how to socialize in the South as a black boy in the safest possible way, because there were just different rules, and the rules in the South were so petty and so degrading that talking back, even touching someone on accident, all of these things were punishable by violence. So he didn't really get it, and I don't think there's any way for him to really understand it. And I also think that, in a perfect world, he wouldn't have to understand that aspect of life like that. So yeah, on the day of his departure, Mamie Till gave him one of the only things that she owned of his father's, which is a ring that had his initials on it. She gave it away to him, and he went flying towards a train, and she had to stop him and say, "What if I don't ever see you again? You need to hug me. I love you." So he was kind of like, "Mom, you're being dramatic," kind of the classic thing, but you never know. And she was right. And she sent him off with his cousins, with his uncle, back down to Mississippi, and that was the very last time she saw him alive. And just to put into context, where and what was going on in Mississippi when Emmett was heading over there, a week before Emmett had arrived in Mississippi, a political activist by the name of Lamar Smith was shot and killed in front of the courthouse in Mississippi for politically organizing. And basically 3 men were taken into custody and they were released, no charges filed. So that was the energy of the time frame in which Emmett was coming. Even though lynching was not common, even though as common in the 1950s and all of that, the racial tension in Mississippi was on a very high note at this point in time. And a week before Emmett had even arrived, some black man was just shot and killed for exercising his rights as an American to protest. So, yeah. So here we get into kind of the more widely debated part of the story. There are many different versions of the story, and I'm just going to kind of talk about the different aspects of each. Now, how this particular day began was, the boys, his cousins, and Emmett were supposed to be sharecropping and earning a little bit of money. That's one version. They were sharecropping, and after a long day of doing that, they decided to go into town and go to the general store to get some candy and then go back home. Another story that I heard is that Emmett and his cousins and some local boys decided to not go to church that day, and instead decided to go to town, to go to the local store to get candy. So both stories, both versions end up with him going to the local store with local boys as well as his cousins to go to the Bryant's general store, who we will meet shortly, and receive some candy. Now, what happens in the store, what happens after is also hotly debated. So again, we'll get into that. It's more kind of there are lots of different versions from different people. Some have been proven to not be true, and I'm just warning you. So if you heard something different or whatever, a lot of different sources have different explanations for why the boys decided to go into town to go to the general store, as well as why what happened to Emmett ultimately happened. So we'll keep going with that. So like I said, whatever compelled them or whatever they're supposed to do, they were either done sharecropping or decided not to attend church, and they ended up in town to get some candy from the Bryant's general store. The Bryants, who were Roy Bryant, who was 24, and Carol Bryant, who was 21, were a young white couple who owned one of the few local general stores in town. Now, their store catered particularly to black sharecroppers. They would often stop off in there to get candy and different supplies for their homes and stuff. So their premier base of clientele were black individuals, were black sharecroppers. Now, on this particular day, when Emmett and his cousins and the local boys decided to go for candy, Roy Bryant wasn't there. He was not helping Carol manage the store. It was Carol and her sister-in-law who were alone in the store, managing and tending to the store. So that's really important to say. Roy Bryant was not there. It was just Carol and her sister-in-law. So in terms of what happened between Emmett and Carol, There are so many different accounts of what happened, but I kind of narrowed it down to two. One, that Roy Bryant and later on his, I believe, friend or cousin said and sold to a newspaper, and the story that the black kids or the black woman who was also in the store on that day also said in defense of Emmett. So you guys decide which one you want to believe. It has later been proven that the story that Roy Bryant sold to the paper was not true, and there was no evidence of that. So just saying, there are multiple versions, but these are the two that I narrowed it down to being. So the first version is essentially what a black bystander had seen in the store when Emmett was in there paying for his candy. Now, the common theme of the story is Emmett was acting inappropriate to Carol Bryant, flirting with her openly, and all of that. But what this bystander was told and saw was that he was preparing to pay for his candy. He had gathered his candy. He was preparing to pay for it. He had paid her. And instead of taking the change from the counter, which is customary, especially interracially, he took the change out of Carol Bryant's hand, which was a huge no-no. And Emmett didn't know that because, again, customs of the North and South were different. So he just assumed that it wasn't that big of a deal, and he went outside. Now, that is what I was told. That is what I heard. And I also heard that she came outside and there was a whistle towards her direction. The wolf whistle heard around the world, is highly contested whether it did or didn't happen. Some people who are with him, some of the local boys said it didn't happen. His cousin said it didn't happen. The lady said it was because he took the change out of Carol Bryant's hand directly and it wasn't about him flirting. So again, lots of different stories about what Emmett did or didn't do in the store to Carol Bryant directly, but that is one version that I believe to be true, just because of how the customs and the manners for black and white people interacting with each other were. I would think it would be thought to be offensive for a black man to take the change out of a white woman's hand directly and touch her at the time, because of just how racist it was. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was that petty. Now, and there was an eyewitness for that story. Again, the whistle is hotly contested whether it did happen or didn't happen, or when it happened. But some people who were with him said as he left the store, she went outside, he whistled at her, and the whole mood changed. Everyone hopped in the car and drove as fast as they could back to Mose Wright's house. Again, up to you to decide which story you want to believe. Now, the story that was proven false was a story that was told by Roy Bryant and his accomplice, and they basically said that Emmett had been going around town while he had been there and bragging to all the local black boys that in Chicago he had a white girlfriend and he had her picture in his wallet, and he was showing her off to everybody and saying he had a white girlfriend and being kind of hot in the pants about it. Basically, then the local boys didn't believe that he had a white girlfriend, so they dared him to go inside and flirt with Carol, and he did. And basically, she went outside to get a gun from the car, and he whistled at her, and by that time he had gotten in the car and dipped. Now, that's a story that Roy Bryant and his accomplice told the public about what Emmett did and who Emmett was. It was there, contested by his family, contested by the people there that day, that said that he never bragged about having a white girlfriend. The white girlfriend thing didn't exist. He never had a picture of a white girl in his wallet, and he did not flirt with Carol. So take that with what you will. That story has been proven to be false. Now, what I don't know in terms of the whistle, either way, it's a petty reason to murder someone. But obviously, we're talking about rural Mississippi in the 50s. So is it that petty? I don't think so. I personally lean on the side of believing the change story and kind of the whatever. And we'll get into Carol's account of the story, especially later in her life, later on. But just know that the story about him having a white girlfriend or anything referencing him bragging about a white girlfriend has been contested and is not true. So yeah, whichever story you believe, either way, the black boys left the store in a rush in fear for their life. Now, the wolf whistle, another person said, like we stated before, when Emmett was 6, he had contracted polio and it left him with a stutter. And many people who talked to him and knew him knew that with certain words, the stutter and the speech impediment made it sound like he was whistling when he was really trying to say different letters and different words and speaking to people. So that is another story that has been tossed in the ring, which is the fact that he did have a speech impediment and maybe wasn't intentionally like wolf whistling at Carol, but it was just something that she heard because of his speech impediment and his stutter. So again, another story to throw into the ring. I also believe that as well. That's me personally. So yeah, again, even the flimsy excuse of the fact that he openly whistled at a white woman is still hotly contested by his family and people who knew him because he did have that stutter because of polio. So again, big question mark surrounding the exact things that happened. You know, the only people that know what happened were really Carol Bryant, the Emmett Till, and the sister-in-law who were watching the interaction. But take it with a grain of salt, take what you will about it, but that is kind of another contesting to the whole he was wolf whistling at this white woman. It was a disrespectful thing that they're trying to make it out to be. However, during the trial, when Carol Bryant was asked to make a statement, she said that Emmett had touched her and grabbed her and groped her while she was stocking shelves in the store, and that is why she had told her husband that about Emmett and her interaction with Emmett. But that was later found out to be a coaching thing, that didn't actually happen, but it was a story made up right before the trial for Carol to have an excuse about, you know, what happened to Emmett. So yeah, as soon as Roy Bryant came back into the store, Carol Bryant got him up to speed with whatever story she chose to say about what happened with the local boys and Emmett, and he became violently angry. He began violently harassing any of the black boys, the black local boys that came into the store that day, trying to get answers, trying to figure out who exactly did this to his wife and all of that kind of stuff. And he was eventually able to get the name of Emmett Till, get where he was staying, and get the fact that he was from Chicago out of violent harassing of the local boys. They ended up, you know, ratting him out because of course, and him and his half-brother John Millam were seen, and eyewitnesses say they were heard talking about and plotting how to get Emmett Till out of Mose Wright's house and how to kidnap him later that day. So in the early hours of August 28th, 1955, around 2 to 3 a.m., Roy Bryant and John Millam showed up to Mose Wright's house and banged on the door. John Millam was armed with a pistol and a flashlight, and they demanded that Mose Wright produce the boy for them and bring the boy out for them to talk to. Okay, so here we go. This is where things start to get really sad. Because Millam was armed with a pistol, Mose Wright had no choice but to kind of let them in because he obviously didn't want to get shot either. So he led them into the room where Emmett was sleeping and woke Emmett up, where then Roy Bryant and John Millam began to aggressively question Emmett about what happened in the store that day with Bryant's wife. Now, because again, Southern custom versus Northern custom, Emmett wasn't saying yes sir, no sir, and answering the questions with the sir attached to it. Both Roy Bryant and John Millen began getting really, really, really upset and more upset about the situation with Emmett and more angry. Now, this is when Mose Wright's wife kind of steps in to try and say, you know, we will give you money if you just leave this boy alone. And it seemed, according to Mose Wright, that Roy Bryant wanted to take the money instead, but his brother was already past the point of complete seething anger because of Emmett's apparent disrespect of him as a man by not saying yes sir, no sir. So the money was off the table. Millam was ready to do what needed to be done to get answers and to become violent, which is why he was the one with a gun. So it could have ended differently had maybe John Millam not been there and not been so riled up, but he was extremely riled up by, again, Emmett's lack of manners, perceived lack of manners to, you know, white Southern men. So instead of taking the money like Roy Bryant wanted to do, he was like, no, we're taking the boy. So they denied taking the money after that. And from that point on, that was the very last time Emmett's family in Mississippi remember seeing him alive, him being dragged out of the house by those two men, with one fully armed and thrown in the back of a truck. So traumatizing, to say the least. Once Emmett was taken from his house, he was tied up and thrown in the back of their truck. And the original plan was to take Emmett to the general store to have Carol Bryant identify him, but Emmett quickly admitted to doing something wrong in the store, because when he got out of the store, the whole vibe changed. Everyone's vibe changed, and they were basically hurried out of town because of whatever happened in the store. Again, up to you to decide which one you want to believe, but there is a lot of unsureness about exactly what happened in the store, but he admitted to whatever it was to them, so they decided not to bring Carol into it, and instead they recruited a local black man to take them to a abandoned barn in Drew, Mississippi, where they took Emmett out, tied him up to a chair, and began to mercilessly beat him. The 18-year-old black boy named Willie Reed, recalls seeing the truck and seeing two white men driving a black kid, a black young man. He wasn't able to really spot him, but he knew he was black, to the abandoned barn in Drew, Mississippi. And, seeing a couple other black men in the car as well, taking them to said place. Now, it is highly speculated whether those two black men who, they were recruited took them there or whatever, or participated or whatever. Basically, what people end up kind of understanding to be true is that these two black men probably worked for either Roy Bryant or John Millam, because John Millam tended to the land. He was a farmer. So it was likely that he got some of his sharecroppers, and they were scared, obviously, of losing their jobs and their livelihood. So they decided to go along with whatever this man was doing, even though it was highly illegal and probably a really painful choice to make. The men that were accused of being there denied being there themselves. So it's, again, hotly contested, but this is from the eyewitness perspective of this young 18-year-old kid, Willie Reed. He later says as he was walking past the barn, he heard screaming, beating, violence, and as he was walking past, John Millam came out and, asked if he had heard anything or seen anything, and he denied that he had heard or seen anything. And John Millam went back inside and continued to beat on Emmett. Willie Reed was one of several people who had claimed to have heard the beatings and the screamings coming from the barn itself. So Willie Reed wasn't the only one to corroborate that fact and to place both Roy Bryant and John Millam at the barn, as well as a black man named Leroy Collins was seen washing blood from the floor of the barn, as well as seeing Emmett Till's boot that he was seen wearing when he last was seen alive. As well, John Millam denied that any kind of murder or anything took place. He said he had killed a deer, and that's where the blood was from, and the boot was his, and that was that. Some said that after they were done beating him, and I'm going to further down in this video insert a clip of Mamie talking about his injuries that he kind of endured, just so you are aware of what this 14-year-old child had to go through. But essentially, it is widely told that his body was thrown off a back bayou bridge near Glendora, Mississippi, which was very close to the Tallahatchie River, and that's why his body ended up there. They essentially, drove home, and that was that. After that, Mo's right, full of anxiety, could not sleep that night. He stayed up until Emmett was supposed to come back. Of course, Emmett never came back to the house. So as the hours began to pass, he got his neighbor and him. They drove into town, and they were looking for Emmett, any sign of Emmett. They were telling people he was missing, trying to lay down the seeds. And when they couldn't find him at all in town, he decided it was time to call Mamie Till and tell her that Emmett was missing, as well as go to the sheriff's and report Emmett missing. Mose Wright went to the sheriff and reported Emmett missing and told them everything about Bryant and Millam showing up to his house and essentially kidnapping him, and them not having seen him ever again after that. Later in the next day, the LaFleur County Sheriff George Smith questioned both Bryant and Millam about the whereabouts of Emmett Till. They both agreed that they had taken him from Mose Wright's house that early that morning, but they denied that they had murdered him or done anything with him. They just said they kidnapped him, talked to him, and then released him in town in front of the Bryant's convenience store, and he's never been seen again. But they were promptly arrested for kidnapping him, because obviously that's fucking kidnapping. So they were arrested for kidnapping, not for murder yet. And now news of this missing boy started to spread nationally, and Medgar Evers, along with some members of the NAACP, got wind of the fact that Emmett Till was missing in Mississippi. So they went down to Money, Mississippi, disguised themselves as sharecroppers, and tried to get as much information as they could from the local black population about the possible whereabouts or what possibly could have happened to Emmett Till. And they were taking note of that in order to conduct their own investigation in order to find out what ended up happening to him, which was super brave of them. So, okay. 3 days after Emmett Till's abduction, his body was found in the Tallahatchie River by two boys who were fishing, and his body was completely unrecognizable, partly due to the fact that he was submerged in water for 3 days, but also partly due to how brutal and mercilessly he was beaten by those men. There was a gunshot wound right above his right ear. It was clear that there was a lot of trauma on his body. He had been beaten mercilessly over every inch of his body. There were some stab wounds, and there was a big cotton gin fan attached to his neck by barbed wire, and with the hopes of the weight of the 75-pound cotton gin fan being able to hold him underwater and keep him there, but he was found. He was completely stark naked, and all he had on was that ring that was engraved with the initials LT for Lewis Till and the date May 25, 1943 on it. Mose Wright was later called in to identify the body, and what helped identify it as Emmett was, of course, the ring that his mom so ceremoniously gave to him right before he left for this trip. So, kind of a really sad full circle moment, but it helped identify his body nonetheless, because he was unrecognizable. Now, I'm going to just kind of pause here and just say this really quickly. Mamie Wright's strength to show the picture of her son's mutilated body and have an open casket and have pictures taken and shown throughout the world, throughout the nation, was incredibly strong. I am not, for the sake of this video, I'm just not going to show it. I feel like that the video won't be monetizable, one, but two, it is an extremely graphic picture, and I'm not gonna lie, I went back and forth about whether I should show it in Mamie Till's memory and to continue on the alertness of what she was trying to accomplish by having had an open casket for him, or should I just, out of respect, not do it, especially for people who don't know or have never seen the picture. It is something that is completely jarring and will scar you. I still have that picture in my mind right now. So I personally decided not to put the picture in the video, so just know that. But I will say, if you are curious about what Emmett Till looked like before, this is it. And if you're curious about what he ended up looking like, there are many side-by-sides on Google if you just Google Emmett Till's funeral. So I hope that you do that, just because it's good knowledge to have, and it's important to see the detailed suffering that this kid went through. He was a kid, but it is incredibly triggering to see, so I decided not to put it in my video, just so you know. So although lynching and racially motivated murders were obviously common in the South around this time, or just in general in the South, this was something that caught on like wildfire because of the particular time that it was brought to the attention of the nation. There was growing conversations around voting rights. There was growing conversation about the ethics around Jim Crow laws, separate but equal. There was a growing conversation about segregation and the racial issue in this country and civil rights. So, Emmett Till's story came at a very particular time where the average American's consciousness had expanded to know and understand these household concepts about Jim Crow and about the negativity felt by the Black community about these laws and regulations put into place, and the inequities in the system naturally that left and continued to keep Black Americans down. So his story came right at the perfect time, because as soon as it was first reported on by a local Mississippi paper in Greenwood, boom, it caught on all over Mississippi, and then it caught on nationally. People were talking about him. The fact that he was missing, people were talking about the fact that he was, they even reported when his body was found, which was extremely, extremely atypical of the time for a white paper to really care anything about a local Black boy that was found in a river. But this story was catching a lot of steam, which was bad for the local authorities in Mississippi, because they were getting a lot of flack, which wouldn't have happened in the 1930s or wouldn't have happened in any other time period previous to this, because the common knowledge and the common understanding was beginning to shift about race relations in this country. So, because Emmett's murder and lynching came at the right time, national news attention, international news attention started to pick up on this story and were reporting on it a lot. So that worked in the favor of, that worked. his story started to become national news, and it was starting to look really bad for the local authorities in Mississippi, and a lot of pressure from the governor of Mississippi was placed on the local authorities to find out and to do a fair trial, or to have a trial, no matter what, in order to kind of quell people's knowledge or people's feelings about how racist Mississippi was, because it was not looking good, because the consciousness had shifted. Part of that kind of trying to hide things under the rug and not really pay attention to certain things, and not really be confrontational about how racist the South was and how racist Mississippi was, and how they're trying to save their name in the midst of this story getting all of this traction, was when Emmett's body was found and looked at and then taken to the funeral home. It was instructed by local authorities to bury him immediately. They were going to put him in the ground almost immediately, and it was Mamie Till that put her foot down and was like, no, I want my son to be buried in Chicago, and I want to do with him what I want to do with him, so send his body directly to me in Chicago. And without her putting her foot down, he would have been buried in Mississippi just days after his body was found, in an attempt to kind of not have as much public pressure and public attention around the lynching of this black boy, and to kind of put it to rest so people could get over it. But she was like, no, I will say when I'm going to put this to rest, and you're not going to dictate how I'm going to bury my son and what I'm going to do about this. So she was able to successfully get Emmett's body flown to Chicago, where she organized a funeral there. Once Emmett's body got it to Chicago, it was received by the A.A. Reiner Funeral Home. And this is where Mamie insisted that she see the body, because she wanted to lay eyes on her son, to make sure that she was burying her son, and to make sure this was her son. And that's bravery, after knowing what his body had gone through and where his body was found. She took it upon herself to essentially go and demand that the funeral home that received his body open up the coffin. Now, let her tell it, she basically said that as she was walking up to the funeral home to see his body, she could smell his body from a mile away as she was walking up to the funeral home. So imagine, again, a body that had been in the Tallahatchie River for over 3 days. He was beaten, all of that kind of stuff, obviously in severe decomposition, and taken out of the river and brought here and sent here for God knows how long it took to get his body up to Chicago. So this body was ripe, and that is something that a lot of people talk about in terms of the funeral and stuff. The body was ripe, and Mamie said that she could smell it from a mile away as she was walking up to see him. Now, at first, the funeral home was like, no, we are not going to open up the coffin. It's too much. We are not going to do it. She put her foot down. She's like, I'm going to see my boy one more time before we bury him. We are opening up this coffin. So they opened it up, and she was confronted with the reality of what had happened to her 14-year-old boy.
What on earth in the world is going on? To get a body that I can't even look at? How do I know what's in the box? I said, I mean, if you can't open the box, I can. And I'm going in the box. I had to see, though, what was in there. And I decided then that I would start at his feet and work my way up, maybe gathering strength as I went. I paused at his midsection because I knew he would not want me looking at him. But I saw enough that I knew he was intact. I kept on up until I got to his chin. And then I was forced to deal with his face. I saw his tongue had been choked out, and it was lying down on his chin. This eye was out, and it was lying about midway the cheek. I looked at this eye, and it was gone. I looked at the bridge of his nose, and it looked like someone had taken a meat chopper and chopped it. I looked at his teeth, and I only saw two. They'd just been knocked out. I was looking at his ears, and that's when I discovered a hole about here, and I could see daylight on the other side. I said, now, was it necessary to shoot him? If that's a bullet hole, was that necessary? And I also discovered that they had taken an axe and they had gone straight down across it.
As you heard, all of the injuries that Emmett's body had sustained over this time period, not to mention the fact that he was found in the river for 3 days. So his body definitely, when I tell you it didn't register as even a human body, it's the truth. It's the truth. But despite all of that, Mamie demanded that Emmett had a proper funeral with an open casket and make it so anyone who was anyone could come and visit his body. She had his body on display for over 5 days in Chicago, and people from all over, far and wide, came. Black people, white people, a lot of people came to put their eyes on the body of Emmett Till, because like I said, this was national news at this point. This story was national news at this point. So this had touched the souls of so many black people in this country, and they, through Mamie's strength to have an open casket, paid their respects to Emmett's body.
At a church on the south side of Chicago, Emmett Till's mutilated body would be on display for all to see.
It was on a Sunday afternoon. I won't ever forget, it was a Sunday afternoon. The church was very calm, the line was very orderly.
I thought that pretty soon the crowd would die down. It looked like all of Chicago was there.
Well, they brought the children with them because Emmett was 14 years old, and they wanted the younger kids to see what happened to Emmett. They were mad, they were angry.
And as we were led into the church, my girlfriends and myself, we walked up to the casket, and it was covered with glass. And we all looked down. This was our friend laying, looking like a monster.
They said that about 1 in every 5 had to be assisted out of the building. They would just go into a faint.
I think black people's reaction was so visceral. Everybody knew we were under attack. And that attack was symbolized by the attack on a 14-year-old boy.
It is estimated that tens of thousands of people came to pay their respect to Emmett's body and pay respect to Emmett Till's family. Tens of thousands from all over the nation came. It was a huge event. Many people saw it. People were fainting at the smell and at the sight. It was people were throwing up. People were getting sick. It was a very, very intense event. The moment of people coming in and filing in to pay their respects to Emmett. So tens of thousands of people came to view his body, and another few thousand came to attend his funeral, which was obviously a super emotional event. And images of his body, like I said before, were floating around nationally after this. After she decided to do the open casket. Jet magazine, which was a prominent, I don't know if it still exists to this day, but it was when I was a kid, is a prominent black magazine. It's really small. And he was on the cover of Jet magazine, and then other magazines began to take his picture and put it in their publications as well. So nationwide, his image was plastered everywhere, not just his story but his image, so it was even more damning to what happened. And it is, I believe, one of the 100 most influential photographs of all time in Time magazine's list. So again, yes, it really ultimately shaped a generation, but yeah, the pictures were floating nationwide, and people's, especially in the North, their feelings towards Mississippi were starting to add into the mix. There's a lot of pressure nationally, particularly in the North, to have this killers, have justice be served. And because of that reaction, remember when I told you before, as the story started to leak, the Mississippi governor was putting pressure on the local authorities to solve this crime properly, Well, because his image was floating around and the North was having a very negative reaction to Mississippi as a whole, instead of kind of opening up, they further insulated themselves. And Mississippi started to be infected with a very xenophobic, anti-North sentiment about what was going on there. And so that started to infect locally how they were feeling about the case. Before, they may or may not have been more likely to cooperate or whatever. But after everything, after they started getting hate from the nation surrounding how racist Mississippi was and being exposed for the true ugly racist face that they had, it ultimately took them to a place where they were just anti-North, very xenophobic, and not really cooperative nationally when it came to trying to seek justice for this case. Because of these changing sentiments in Mississippi itself, the Tallahatchie County Sheriff, who had been there to recover Emmett's body and had previously said that it was 100% Emmett and agreed that it was 100% Emmett, and that they had a pretty solid case against Bryant and Millam, he had changed his tone as more national attention came to Mississippi about this case. So before, he had agreed this was Emmett, he was identified by Mose Wright, and he was like, this is a solid case. After the funeral and everything happened, he essentially backtracked and said, the NAACP, when they came down here, brought the body of this random person and threw it in the river to make Mississippi look bad. So the vibe had changed a lot, but that kind of was starting to affect the validity of how this case was going to go. Before the funeral, it was possible that these men maybe could have seen some charges, maybe, because it's still iffy. But after, they were basically kind of staunch Mississippian people, and they didn't want to throw their own to the wolves, so they were gonna protect them at all costs. So if that meant backtracking and lying about whether or not the body was Emmett's or not, that's what ended up happening. So the case started to fall apart. Bryant and Millam were indicted on murder charges as this was going on, but as the case began to fall apart and many of the important pieces of the case started to fall apart, and people started to backtrack what they were saying about the Millam and Bryant and Emmett's body even being really Emmett's body, the state attorney was less and less confident that he could get charges that could stick to these two white men, especially in the context for which they were saying that the case happened, that he essentially they had killed a black man for insulting a white woman, which was one of the most ultimate crimes. So he was unsure he could get the actual murder charges to stick. Do you want to know how crazy and racist this area was? Roy Bryant and John Millam were not wealthy white men. They were not well off. They could not afford to be represented by attorneys at all. But as their case started to float around, 4 prominent Mississippian attorneys decided to volunteer their services pro bono in the defense case against this murder charge, and they were able to put up jars for collection of their representation, to get money from the representation for the trial in local businesses all around Money, Mississippi, and they were able to collect over $10,000 from the residents. So if that doesn't smell and reek of white privilege to you, I don't know what else to say. But this is how these murderers were treated. Not a lot has changed. The day before the trial, a young black man named Frank Young was quoted and claimed to have been able to find 2 eyewitnesses of what happened to Emmett, who were willing to testify in order to put these men in jail. But instead of trying to work them into testifying in order to have a full free trial, the local sheriff, put all 3 of those men under arrest, so there was no chance that they could testify that next day at trial. Now, this trial happened in September in 1955. It lasted for about 5 days, and it was highly attended. It is said that the courtroom had 280 seats, and all 280 seats were filled. Of course, the courtroom was extremely segregated, and it is said that the judge greeted the black people and the black media people who were there by saying, "Hello, niggers." So, going well. This is going well. This is obviously going to be a successful case, right? So, essentially, the defense decided to take the position of what following suit of what the local sheriff had kind of put into the ether, in that there's no real way to identify if this body was truly Emmett Till's. The only way that it was identified as him was from a ring, and that could have been placed there, and then this could be all a sham. That could be a whole nother body and not even Emmett's, and Emmett could still be alive. So they are starting to throw dirt and cast out into the prosecution's story. They essentially stuck with the fact that Bryant and Millam had obviously been seen taking Emmett from Mose Wright's house and been seen along the way by several people. But what they claimed was that they set him free when they got to town after talking with him about what he had done. And basically, the defense's whole situation was, they claimed that they took him from the house. Yes, they kidnapped him from the house, but they set him free that same night. He could have run off. He could have gone anywhere. And we're supposed to believe you that this is his body. So that's what was thrown by the defense's side. Obviously, the prosecution had more facts on their side, more eyewitnesses on their side. But I think an important thing to note is, in the South in 1955, it was illegal for black people, men or women, or women in general, to be a part of a jury. So the entire jury was white men, local white men. So again, when we talk about these stories, this wasn't that long ago. First and foremost, my grandpa was alive when this happened. This wasn't that long ago. So when we talk about jury selection and different things like that, all of these play to uphold white supremacist ideals. All of these laws were able to box people out so convictions could not be met. You could say that, it went through the legal system, but if black people and women were not allowed to be a part of the jury to have their opinions heard about whether or not they believe the defense or not, is it truly justice, or is it more of a sham situation? Do you get what I mean? Mamie decided to testify to there being truth in the fact that she had warned Emmett about the social system in the South, and the defense began casting doubt in her story, basically by saying, well, you have a $400 life insurance policy on him and all of these things, so you could also be lying, and how could you properly identify your own son? So she knew from then that this wasn't going in the direction that she wanted to go, so she basically told her people who came with her in the NAACP that they should just leave early. She wanted to go back to Chicago and, didn't want to hear the verdict for herself. She basically was like, it's not going to be a verdict that I want to hear. I'm not going to stay here because clearly this is not going to go the way it should go to pay respect to Emmett Till's life. And it didn't. Let's get into that. On September 23rd, the all-white male jury acquitted the men of all of the charges. The jury only took 67 minutes to deliberate, and one juror was quoted as saying, had we not all stopped for a drink, we would have done it much quicker. It was widely said that they were told to make it seem like they were deliberating for a long time, and the defense attorney basically turned before they were told to go deliberate on whether these men were guilty or not, or basically told to appeal to the fact that they were Anglo-Saxon and what would their ancestors say if they do not pronounce these men innocent. So, of course, as Mamie had predicted, they were let go of all charges. In November of 1955, a grand jury refused to even charge the men with kidnapping, even though they had self-admitted to kidnapping Emmett. Again, in their story, they had admitted to kidnapping Emmett from Mose Wright's house, but they did not admit to murdering him. But the jury wouldn't even hear the trial. They had totally wiped the slate clean with that trial and refused to even charge them with kidnapping, even though they had already admitted to kidnapping. So again, the system was broken. Essentially, after that, as I said before, both Roy Bryant and John Millam were not wealthy white men. Remember, their defense attorney was pro bono, and they had to collect jars of change from people in local businesses to raise money for their defense. So they did not have a lot of money. And after this trial, honey, this situation took a turn for the dark for them financially. Basically, Roy Bryant's store, as I said before, catered to the sharecroppers in the area, the black people in the area, and due to the fact of what happened to Emmett, they totally boycotted their store. So within a few months, I think it was as quickly as 15 months, their store was gone. They could not afford to keep it up, and their store was gone. As for John Millam, like I said, he was a farmer, and he depended on sharecroppers for work. Of course, he was boycotted and could not maintain the land any longer, so he lost out on money, and basically they were kind of forced to move. I know at some point they were in Texas, and at some point Carol and Roy Bryant got divorced post this, and both men died of cancer in their 60s. John Millam in the 80s, and I believe Roy Bryant sometime in the 90s died of cancer, and he was 60-something years old. So again, not very long ago at all. And that's kind of where their story kind of ended. Basically, accounts about Roy Bryant basically said that he was increasingly paranoid because, well, we'll get into that. After all of the verdicts had been delivered and they were free men, these men, because they were so broke and needed money, decided to do a exclusive interview with a magazine called Look magazine, where, because they were protected by the law of double jeopardy, where no person could be charged with the exact same crime again, especially if they were found to be innocent for that crime, they admitted in that interview the fact that they murdered Emmett, why they murdered Emmett, how they murdered Emmett, and where they murdered Emmett. They admitted to kidnapping. They admitted to the murder. They admitted to the beating. The story as to why was obviously a lie. They were, using the story of Emmett had that white girlfriend and was showing pictures and was bragging. They had said that once they took him into the barn, like they couldn't stop beating him because he was saying that he was like them and his grandmother was white and he loved white women and all of this stuff, and he was just this like bold, brash, 14-year-old guy, black kid. So hearing him brag about being with white women pissed them off, and it took them to the next level where they ended up killing him. But they described everything, all of the injuries that Emmett had accurately, even though that story was probably fabricated, of course. And they admitted to murdering him, and they were paid $4,000 for that interview. And their whole reputation in the town of Money and in Mississippi in general was totally flipped. Because again, remember, these people were insulating around these men. They believed the story that Emmett had possibly just run away and the body was placed there, that these men had nothing to do with that. They were, for heaven's sakes, they were taking collections on their defense attorney, crowdsourcing the amount of money needed to fund this whole situation. So they had a lot of support in their local area. But after they did this interview and admitted to killing him, because there was, no way they could get charged for that, for the little money that they had, because all the black people were boycotting their businesses, they obviously were not remorseful in their interview. They admitted to killing him, and everyone in town rescinded their support of these men. Pretty much they were outcasts. Now, Carol Bryant, I believe she isn't alive anymore to this day, but she did an interview in 2008 where she essentially admitted that she had lied about Emmett whistling at her or any kind of inappropriate behavior from Emmett Till. It had been a complete fabrication from her, and she basically said that boy didn't deserve what he got, obviously with a touch of remorse. Now, this case has been reopened several times by the FBI, and it was reopened recently because people claim to have found new information about the case. Mamie Till has long since passed away, and it's now Emmett's other cousins and stuff trying to keep the helm and the pressure on getting some sort of apology or admittance about the miscarriage of justice that was done to their family member. But yeah, that's the story of Emmett Till. So that was the incredibly depressing and emotional story of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Chicago boy born and raised who wanted so desperately to connect with his family, meet his other family, go to a place he's never been, go to where his family originated in Money, Mississippi. And because of the cultural differences, that he didn't understand the nuances of how the races related to each other according to North and South regulations, he was murdered. And for nothing, because it was admitted later on Carol Bryant's interview that she did in 2008 that she had lied and fabricated the whole thing. And you see how the system itself played a role in not providing justice for his family, not providing justice for his memory, and not providing justice for his legacy. It was his people, his mom alone, that were able to provide some sort of justice for his name through the very brave act of having him be displayed to the world. And having the world have to confront the fact that lynching was very real at the time, the racial issues were very tense at the time, and no matter how much the country wanted to be lulled to sleep and ignore the fact that this was a reality, it was true. I I think one of the most interesting parts of this story is the ways in which the sheriff and the governor and the judge and the jury and the defense attorney and the culture at the time of whiteness all work together in order to provide some broke white men with A1 defense attorneys for free. The community was able to collect over $10,000 on their behalf. And, the all-white jury, decided immediately that they were not guilty, and they only drug it out to 67 minutes because they were told previously that if it was too short, it would look bad, even though it already looked bad. All of these aspects and arms and ways that the system itself was, used in favor of whiteness. Which is what again, another example of what we mean when we say the system works for you by also subjugating people of color and black people constantly. The system worked for these men, and there was justice that was served because people lied, people accused, people, didn't even listen to the other side of the story. They were told to appeal to their Anglo-Saxon ancestry and make these guys write these guys off as innocent because they were also white men. The fact that black people and women were not allowed to be a part of a jury in 1955 also was a big hampering in this case. And the fact that it was all based on a fabrication from one white woman and her extremely violent husband and his brother, half brother. Now, there's some solace in the fact that they were not able to have a happy life after that. They went broke after that. And there's some solace in the fact that Emmett Till's death and story inspired Rosa Parks to not give up her seat, which thus, you know the domino effect. You know how it all went down. So to me, there's some silver lining to this, but it's just unfortunate that it had to happen as a result of the death of an innocent 14-year-old boy who just didn't know the social cues of the South and made just a mistake. Black people aren't really allowed to make mistakes in this country, as you can see, and a lot of times it's either punishable through a long prison sentence or it's a punishable by death in Emmett's case. But I think this is a really important story that people need to hear about, and young kids need to hear about it. To me, I think it's appropriate for kids who are 14 to hear about the story because he was 14 when this story happened. To be honest, I think kids of all ages should be learning about racism at the level that they can understand it. And this conversation about critical race theory and all of this stuff that's kind of getting hype in our country right now is an attempt by the establishment to, again, continue to protect itself by basically saying that confronting the actual history of this country, which is that it was based on genocide and the bodies of black slaves in order to be what it is, and telling that history in a truthful way that doesn't necessarily center whiteness, but also allows for people to see the atrocities that were okayed by the U.S. government at the time, okayed by white people at the time, that were thought to be normal, like lynching, like Emmett Till's story, like all of these things, all the stories that show that the white people at the time were not nice, genial, willing to get along, and ready to discard of slavery and move to a place where we could all be equal, which we all know isn't true because we aren't equal right now. All of those stories that kind of spit in the face of whatever they want to believe about their heritage is now deemed as racist and is not they're lobbying to not have it be allowed to be taught in schools now. So there's an old quote, I forgot by who: control education and you control the future. And I think we are living in a very pivotal time right now when it comes to educating children about the truth of this country and making sure that they understand the truth of this country, and demystifying all the myths and the white lies that we've been told to believe in. And we are seeing a very staunch pushback from the establishment to keep things as they are, and to keep stories that put white people in a bad light or call into question their takes about what happened in this country historically. Those stories are supposed to be pushed into the nether regions or completely erased. The fact that I only heard about this story in college is really embarrassing, considering I went to a very prestigious private school for high school that prides itself on being big on education. And to me, they dropped the ball when it comes to race stuff. And the fact that I was hearing it for the first time after going to and my parents paying for an education like that is kind of embarrassing on behalf of the school. I'm not gonna lie. I think it's important to remember that the more we embrace the true history of this country, the more we can move past it. And I think that's what everybody wants to do. No one wants to drag this out. No one wants to continue to have inequality and have the race problem be a problem in this country. But because people are so unwilling to confront the realities and the truth of what their ancestors could have done, completely have done to other people for no apparent reason, just to be greedy, just to be selfish, just to be white supremacist and racist, there's no way we can move forward as a country without acknowledging that history. And Emmett Till's story is a beautiful catalyst for this. I wish his story was taught before we are taught about Rosa Parks' story, so that we can see more of the climate of the country at the time. But that's just me being me. But suffice it to say, I believe this story is so powerful, and it took a lot for Emmett Till's mother to do what she did, and she will forever be, known in history for that. And, obviously rest in peace to Emmett Till, gone too soon. R.I.P. And that being said, Black Lives Matter and free Palestine until it's backwards. Bye.